On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Nate Lee. He is the Chief Information Security Officer at Tradeshift. We're going to be talking about some of the challenges in establishing security in early stage startups, or just startups in general. A couple of things that Nate's going to be covering are, a lot of people delay putting in security plans in place, only to find bigger challenges later on. And how do you sell that? How do you go to the right team or the right management people and explain the fact that you need to do it sooner? And I think Nate's going to have some examples of easy wins you can put in place. And I use the word easy loosely there, but there will be some hopefully low-hanging fruit you can tackle. Nate, thanks for being on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. All right, let's start off at the top and understand two things. One, what does Tradeshift do? And then just high level, as a CISO, what are some of your responsibilities?
Sure. Well, Tradeshift as a whole, we're a B2B platform. So for businesses to transact and digitize their supply chain. So all your purchasing, and then tying into kind of the AP systems, being able to report on your supply chain and do financing on that. So it's fairly sizable. We've had about 600 billion, I think, through the platform. So lots and lots of transactions and money moving around there. And as far as the security side of things, I'm responsible for the security program as a whole. So the GRC side of things, application security, product security, infrastructure security, IT security, all things security.
All things security. That falls on your plate. And I guess this episode really what it boils down to is, a lot of companies, it doesn't have to be an early stage startup or mid-stage startup. It could be a larger company as well. I mean, everyone has security needs at different stages, but I guess sometimes we talk, here about, hey, you got to start sooner, and you got to take the right steps, put the foundations in, and maybe you don't even have a security person responsible, and somebody is trying to figure those pieces out. I guess those are all slightly difficulties that people are going to face at different stages. And I guess when you're looking at security, and you're kind of looking at the maturity curve of, hey, we're starting out to, hey, we're really mature. When you're looking at the companies that are, to the left of that curve, that they don't have the robust capabilities, where does somebody start, right? So obviously, as a startup, you're going to at some point, especially if you're selling to enterprises, that you're going to need some kind of SOX compliancy and SOC 2 down the road. Most people are worried about selling; they don't worry about addressing that up front. Yeah, how do you view that? Is it one of those, hey, when we get to it, we get to it? Is it, hey, there are things that you could be doing sooner than later versus waiting?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question, and depends fairly heavily on the space you're in. Like you mentioned, if you're planning to sell to enterprises, having a SOC 2 is kind of table stakes. It's as much for sales and marketing as it is for security. Everyone can point to the ways you can have a SOC 2 and be insecure, and not have a SOC 2 and be secure. So it isn't necessarily just for the sake of security, but really to drive the business forward. I think if you're in the business of selling to other businesses, it really pays to plan for that ahead of time, because it's an inevitability that you'll need this. So I think as soon as you have product market fit, you're starting to get traction and starting to sell. It makes sense to really put some more wood behind that, I think. Even before that, though, there are certainly things you can do that are fairly low impact, things that will make it a lot easier as far as policies that need to be implemented and whatnot. I think a lot of times people don't want to necessarily have process for process sake. Obviously, no one really wants that. But there are things like change reviews and having vulnerability management and kind of putting some of the automation guardrails in place, where that becomes your standard way of working. And then when you do have to kind of push a little further, it's not this huge shock to the system. It doesn't blow up all your processes. You're kind of already working in that way. So I think it certainly pays to kind of keep it front of mind as you're growing an engineering org and building a product and team. Just what are things we can kind of put in place that add value now, but also will make it a lot easier to implement a program in the future.
Absolutely. And I guess, the group that obviously will definitely need some security fit is if you are more of a B2B or selling to enterprise. That is, like you mentioned, that is coming. But if you're on the consumer side, right, and your biggest priority is I need to get my MVP up, I need to get V1, I need to keep showing progress. That is my sole existence
Sure,
because I need.
absolutely.
When you come security, you were talking about avoiding process for process sake. Obviously, it's going to slow things down, right? There's going to be a point at which you have to slow down to incorporate security. But when you're that early, should you? I mean, obviously, you're a security person, so I know you're going to answer it. But maybe the better question is what should you be thinking earlier stage in terms of some of the. You mentioned vulnerability management and whatnot. And if you're not a security person, more importantly, and you're not thinking about these, do you come up with the checklist? Are you Googling, looking for security checklists? How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also a great question because many of these companies aren't going to have a security expert, and no one really wants to write insecure code or build insecure products. But if you're an early stage startup and you have some sort of breach or you lose customer trust, I mean, you have the potential of shooting your foot off before you even get started. So I mean, it is worth considering. There's no right answer for one size fits all for everyone. But again, I think some of those automation bits that you can put in place are worth investing in. Again, everybody's different, but things like how can we make sure as part of running our services that people are keeping things up to date and we're not letting technical debt pile up. It's always a trade-off because, like you said, you're trying to get your product out. You want an MVP of the new features rolling out, all of that. But there's interest to be paid on that debt, and if things get older and older and older, you still have to address it at some point, and it's going to be much more expensive the longer you let it sit there. So it's more, I think, of being cognizant of what some of these trade-offs are, and then you can make a decision that fits well with your business, your risk tolerance, and kind of where you're at in the cycle. That might be a non-answer, but I think it is very, at early stage in particular, it's very individual to a given company. But I think it is worth doing some of the basics, like, hey, let's get training for all the engineers building the product so they know OWASP top 10 stuff. They're not writing bad SQL that's or SQL injection susceptible code. They're not writing stuff that's susceptible to cross-site scripting because someone's gonna have to go back and fix that automatically. But you may as well get that kind of where people aren't writing that sort of thing into your code. It'll save you a bunch of time down the road.
I mean, definitely. I guess and this just popped in my head. I'm curious how you view it. Is obviously when you're a younger startup, or even as you're growing, you don't have specialists. You have people wearing different hats. And obviously, when you mention to write, SQL that's not vulnerable to an injection, you might not have experts in SQL writing code because of what you mentioned. You're running real hard, and obviously you're writing that. And if you don't know what you don't know, I mean, obviously you mentioned you could get some, training, understand how not to write that. Is it one of those where at some point when you do finally put a security program in place, you're going back and digging through the covers? It sounds like a heck of a hard thing looking for those vulnerabilities, especially if the tech debt has mounted because, MVP to V1, you've let it go because it's not priority.
I mean, it can be. It depends on any given case. A lot of them are fairly easy to find with tools, static code analysis. It'll look and point out all the stuff. A lot of the stuff. I think the problem though becomes if that's code that was written 2 years ago by someone who doesn't work here anymore, someone's going to have to fix that, and it's going to take them days to kind of figure out what's going on. What's the context of this? What do I need to consider with making changes? So it can take a lot longer versus if someone gets that feedback right away because you put the right tools and processes in place, it takes someone 5 minutes, 10 minutes to fix it when it's kind of the active thing they're working on and they get immediate feedback. So again, it's about that trade-off of, yes, it takes time to build and put some of these tools and processes in place early, but the dividend and payoff is certainly many-fold over.
Okay. I guess, you mentioned, SQL injection. It's, you could put the tool in place. Obviously, figuring out how to fix it's a whole different problem. What are some of those that you mentioned? Vulnerability management. Obviously, we covered SQL injection. When you look at vulnerability management, are there tools that you could put in place? Do you have any that you've seen that have good effect?
I mean, internally, we use SonarQube, just doing static code analysis. So that will detect if somebody's writing things where it's going to issue a SQL query that has user input dumped in instead of parameterized queries. But then I think there's also the whole third-party software dependency side of things. So all of the open source code and libraries you're pulling in, those have vulnerabilities found all the time. They're constantly being updated. So things like GitHub has Dependabot. I think GitLab might have something similarly. But things like that, where it'll automatically create a pull request. You can set it so, hey, if it's 90% likely to be compatible, just create the pull request. You can even have it merge it. That sort of tooling makes it very easy for developers to keep things up to date. Again, if you let it sit for years and years and no one looks at it, now you're 20 versions behind. There's piles of breaking changes, and someone again has to familiarize themselves with all this code that's ancient, which takes far, far longer than kind of incrementally moving along the way. So again, I think some of these tools are things that even early-ish stage, I mean, probably not when you're a three-person shop, but when you get to where, again, you have product market fit, things are moving, you're starting to push code more rapidly with a lot of people, that's where it makes sense to start to get all of these things in place.
And I guess, like, if you're a founder or you're VP of engineering and you're in a high growth company, when does a company start really looking at needing to hire that security professional, right? And typically, obviously, bringing in CISO would be great to oversee the program, but you still need somebody to do work as well. And who would that first hire typically be?
Yeah, I think again, it's probably different for many different cases as there are out there. Where I've seen it commonly come in is when you hit around the 150, 200 person mark. There's going to be outliers on either side, but that's, I think, where I see it most often, that people start ramping that up. And I think it's important to have someone when you're first getting started who's kind of gone through the startup cycle from being that size to up to 1,000 people or whatever, because what works for a smaller company isn't necessarily going to scale well to 1,000 people or 2,000 people. But at the same time, you don't want to put the process and controls in place that a 2,000 person company might need when you're much smaller, because it starts to be a big drag on productivity. So someone who kind of understands those trade-offs and what the life cycle of some of these controls should look like as you're growing, being aware of that, I think will save a lot of heartache for all parties, because it's really easy to kind of stomp all over the party when you're a security person trying to put in controls and make things kind of safer, quote unquote. So really being cognizant of what's the right amount of control and the right amount of process for a given size and kind of directionality and growth and all of that.
Yeah, it seems a lot of art. Anytime I think you bring process into any function, all of a sudden it becomes a very delicate balance of too little, too late, too much. All of a sudden I'm slowing things down. I'm letting things get too loosey goosey. When you're looking to bring in that first person, kind of as you mentioned, and you're going through the interview process, if you don't have somebody in-house to ask those questions because they don't have a security background, any recommendations as to how you've seen it done in terms of trying to make sure you're vetting out that first security person the right way, knowing what questions asked? Are there some things that you should be looking for in terms of thought process, approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super important, because having a mistake there is going to be much more costly than a mistake with your average hire. I would almost flip that on its head, though, and ask the candidate, what kind of questions would you ask us as you're trying to figure out the right level of control and process? Because you want someone who's going to really try to understand the environment and the culture and the risk tolerance. Someone who has a good systems understanding, so they can actually make recommendations that reflect kind of the ground truth. So I think having someone who's very pragmatic and a good listener, in addition to all of the kind of table stakes security technical knowledge you would assume should probably be there. I think that's very important, because very likely you're not going to hit it right the first time. You're going to build a process, it's going to be there, and it's either going to be, like you said, too much or too little. And you want someone who goes into it with that expectation and knowing that, hey, we're going to need to iterate on this. It's part of a continuous improvement drive. It's not a point in time thing that we put in place and that's it from here on out. So having someone who's pragmatic and kind of open to feedback cycles is really important.
Yeah, absolutely makes a lot of sense, and also gives you a good assessment of how they analyze and break down that problem, and can actually articulate that to you, which I know security professionals are that's something they love to do. I guess a question is, let's say you've gone through the process, you've hired someone, all of a sudden your developers are going to have someone working with them that they didn't have previously. There's going to be some new requirements, some different processes in place. How should you, like in an ideal world, introduce that security person into your program? Make sure the developers understand the role, the relationship, and all of a sudden, what was a million miles an hour without some security oversight is now, again, some process. We don't know to what degree, because every use case is different, but there'll be some changes for that development team.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to also kind of define that as part of some of the goals you're starting with. If you have an engineering background for the security person that you're bringing in, then certainly they should be able to work much more closely and are going to more easily have that empathy with the engineering team. If you're bringing someone in with a GRC background who isn't necessarily from an engineering, having some years of experience in engineering, it's going to be much harder from the standpoint of dealing with engineering controls. So in the first case, if it's someone who's very familiar with the engineering side of things, I think really just having them kind of build those relationships within engineering to understand what's working, what's not working, and get that fast feedback loop. That's going to be really helpful. If it's someone with more of a GRC background, I think it's probably helpful to have them work with someone who wants to be kind of that security champion role on the engineering side, and you can start discussing requirements and where we think we want to be and need to be, and then they have a partner in engineering that they can work with to kind of develop that into controls and automation, things like that.
Yeah, I guess that's as you kind of mentioned, the background with the engineering, understanding the relation there, finding the security champion. When you're looking at, I guess the engineering team's perspective, and you're finding a security champion, all of a sudden you have a little bit of a matrix organization, because you have somebody asking you to do things that's not necessarily your manager. Obviously, they're working with your manager. That matrix dynamic, as it were, is additional overhead, additional maybe friction. When you're looking at that, what should you be hoping that security person's doing to make that engineer's life easier?
I mean, I think you're very right when it comes to that champions program. I mean, kicking it off, people are going to have concerns that, hey, am I losing half a head count or a quarter of head count or whatever it is? So helping them see the value, and some of that is we're up-leveling engineers. We're going to be spreading this knowledge around. And the other side is really helping them see the benefit and the value of doing this. Having that engineering input means that again, as the controls and process are being developed, they're getting that feedback directly from engineering, which means it's going to be kind of more aligned with engineering values and more aligned with the process. And if there are things that are going to slow down the organization as a whole, that feedback is going to be direct and very quick back to the people who are kind of setting some of these policies and controls. So I would just really emphasize the kind of the long-term and more strategic gains that you're getting. And yes, there's some hourly hit, but really looking at it as beneficial for the whole org, and in a way that far outstrips any of the hourly commit that might involve. Obviously, some people might still have problems with that, and certainly if their team is already strapped, that's something where you'll have to do some horse trading, I'm sure, of figuring out what this means for headcount and getting it accounted for. But I think having that buy-in with engineering leadership can make it much easier and really helpful in a way that makes it so that other people want to join your program in the future. If they see, hey, we can learn new skills that are in high demand. That's something that's kind of a perk for engineers as opposed to like an extra chore we're slapping on them.
Yeah, I guess because I think you mentioned avoiding process for process sake, and then obviously now you're talking about having the input into those processes. I mean, it feels like what you're. Yeah, I think it's going to be better buy-in. It sounds like you're going to have engineering actually feeling that they have a vested control. It's not the quote unquote no police just to levy those processes and go, hey, you deal with it and throw it across the fence. It seems like that adoption rate might actually improve with that scenario.
Yeah, and I mean, ideally, you don't even have to worry about adoption rate, right? You're putting controls in place that are automatic. There's some guardrails there. Again, developers don't want to write insecure code. They don't want to have faulty products. So it's how can we best enable them to have that be the default way of working. And by working with engineering, it also means you're going to have people who have that background to build the integrations into whatever you're using in IntelliJ and GitHub and your build system, and just kind of getting all of these bits and pieces so that it's part of a standard workflow instead of a process or a like a policy that's in your wiki somewhere that no one reads.
I guess when you're looking at companies that choose, like you said, every use case is different. To delay some of this, right? We're talking about companies that, hey, let's forward think, let's put some thought into getting ahead of this, not wait for the point in which, hey, I do need this as a checkbox, or I'm gonna potentially see the breach and then react. When you're looking at people that are typically delaying this or kind of putting it off, I mean, I don't know if you have a stat, but I was just kind of curious. Is there any type of metrics, like how much more costly it is to come back to address this versus putting some of the plumbing in early?
Yeah, I think like Ponemon Institute, I think they have some studies on it. I don't remember the number. I think it was something like 90x the time to fix something after the fact once you figure in context switching and again getting up to speed on what is it I'm trying to fix, what do I have to know, and kind of familiarizing yourself with the code base that you're not familiar with. So it's significantly more expensive. I think part of the problem is that as a stat, that's kind of eye-popping and shocking. But then it's hard to really kind of quantify that beyond that, right? It's in our head. It's like, okay, well, it's more expensive, but I need to get this thing done and I need this out the door now. I've got a commitment. So great, but we'll fix it later. Right. And I think it's one thing to be kind of aware of that fact, and another to how do you internalize that so you're actually making your business decision and understanding that trade-off of how you're using your resources wisely.
Yeah, I mean it sounds like it is the pressures of the engineering team of having to deliver, especially if at your earlier stage or even your series A or B, before you've had the need to put security versus slowing down. The 90x is eye-popping, but I'm not a security person, but I always kind of view this as, if you're actually physically building a bridge or a building, at some point somebody's going to, stress test your system, whether it's voluntary or somebody will do it externally. You will find out at some point whether or not the stuff you built is secure.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess. I'm sure this is a faulty analogy, but with the bridge thing, if you find out after the bridge is already up and running that, hey, you need to replace one of the pillars or the cables or whatever, obviously that's just monumentally more expensive than just getting it right the day of when somebody first kind of puts that piece down. It's worth always keeping in mind because it's so easy to let it slip and kind of we'll deal with that later type of thing.
Yeah, what's interesting is, the waterfall methodology, was hey, if there is an issue and you find it out later, it's obviously more difficult to go back and address because you've already built a ton of code. You're at the end before you test. Scrum comes in, iterative building comes in and goes, we should be testing and releasing in faster cycles. What I almost heard you saying is, well, security, if you're waiting, similar to what waterfall was, that's just a way more complicated, way of dealing with it versus, well, if it's incorporated, kind of more along the lines of the way modern software is developed, then obviously it's catching these issues right at the release point and not waiting as code is built up.
Yeah, and I mean, even before release, I mean, just as it's being it's being written and checked in.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly where I think some of those basic investments in like static code analysis and just putting those guardrails up for people. I mean, I think you generally want to be able to trust your developers to make smart decisions. You want to be able to, and they want to make smart decisions. So how can we provide that right guidance and the right context to them so that they can, get that immediate fast feedback and work on it? Because yeah, like you said, if you wait and do it kind of waterfall style where security is the toll gate right before you release your 9 months of work, I mean, there's just no world where that's cost effective. I mean, it's less secure and it's going to cost you way more money.
Yes. I mean, this is, I think, super interesting because I think a lot of companies, different sizes go through this all the time. Even you see big companies have to determine when to ramp up security to a certain point, or hey, we're secure enough, we don't want to spend more. I mean, this is not just early stage companies. So interesting perspectives. I was going to ask you, if for a future guest that will be on, would you have a topic or maybe a single question you'd like somebody else to actually answer, or a topic you'd like to have somebody cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe similar to what we were just talking about, how can we, as security practitioners, really make kind of these impacts more real for stakeholders, whether that's an engineering team or the executive team more generally. We have methodologies for risk assessment. There's FAIR, there's this and that, where you can do quantitative or qualitative. But I always get the feeling that people see those, and it's great to do risk-based kind of security program management to decide what to focus on. But outside of the security group, kind of those numbers are always looked at as a bit of a hocus pocus. There's so many assumptions and it's probabilities, and it's not very concrete compared to many other things with like, hey, if we sign this deal, we'll get this revenue. You just have to deliver these features. It's much more gray than that. So, I mean, I would love to hear more about how others have really made that concrete and real for messaging upwards, because I think that's really at the core of how you decide and how you should be prioritizing kind of security priorities, how much you're spending on security, how much is enough, like you were saying. It really comes back to what is our risk, and kind of how does that translate into monetary terms.
It's and just I know you have limited time, but just something interesting that's always been on top of my mind, based on your your question, was you see security professionals laid off as businesses have financial impacts, and obviously financially they might have to lay people off. It's a very interesting department to see get laid off, because obviously we hear all the stats about how how few professionals there exist, and then all of a sudden security is no longer put something in. It's not like putting ADT or some security system in your home and you're fairly covered. This is a constant battle, and things are evolving with the cloud. But yet you see professionals laid off when financially it doesn't make sense, and you always wonder, you go, well, what happens based on that decision? Sure, you save that cost, but to your point, and the reason I brought that up was making that, I guess, that impact real for stakeholders. I don't know if that could shift that narrative, or hey, you know what, companies financially have to take care of the bottom line, and they do take a little bit of risk, and that's just part of life.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen a lot of anecdotally, I haven't seen a lot of people getting laid off out of the security side of things. But it's a business, right? And I mean, businesses exist to turn a profit and returns for shareholders, and security is and should be very much aligned with that. If we cost more than the commensurate reduction in risk, you're probably spending too much on security. Maybe it's you're planning for future growth, then great. But it really, should be something that makes sense from the financial standpoint. And if it doesn't, either you're spending too much, or you're spending not enough, or your models are bad. I mean, there's something there. So it's certainly, again, one that there's not necessarily a single right or wrong answer. It really depends on how the company thinks about that. But I mean, just laying people off isn't necessarily a bad sign, although generally that's probably a red flag, I would say.
Absolutely. Well, before I let you go, I was going to ask you if somebody does want to reach out to you and talk to you about anything you mentioned on the podcast. What is a good way of getting in touch with you? Social, email, LinkedIn, Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I guess LinkedIn is probably best, mostly because I'm fairly easy to find there as the CISO at Tradeshift. People can certainly feel free to message if they have any questions or want to chat about any of that stuff further.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to include that. Again, Nate, thanks for coming on and sharing. I appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. Be back again. Different guest, different topic. Until then, I always ask for two things. One, if you know someone that can cover Nate's topic, I think that'd make for a great episode. Please reach out to me, and we'll have you on the show to talk about that. I think that'd be great. Also, if you found the podcast useful, share it. That's how the podcast has grown. It's mainly organic. So I thank everyone who does share it. And that's it for this episode. I'll be back again. Thank you and goodbye.